Today we dive into the story of one of the most ruthless queens in history. She is remembered as the blood-soaked Queen of Madagascar, a ruler whose reign of terror lasted for more than 3 decades. Under her rule, tens of thousands perished through brutal executions, forced labour, and the infamous poison ordeals. This is the story of Queen Ranavalona, a monarch who defended her nation's independence, yet became a nightmare for her own people. The mysterious island of Madagascar. Far out in the Indian Ocean, separated from the African mainland by the waters of the Mozambique Channel, lies one of the world's great islands, Madagascar. To most of the outside world in the 18th and 19th centuries, this land was a mystery, a place half hidden by distance and half shielded by its isolation. What little was known came from sailors' tales, scattered reports of traders, and the rare descriptions of missionaries who dared to step ashore. The island itself was vast, the 4th largest in the world, a miniature continent with mountains, high plateaus, deep forests, and long stretches of coastline. The climate was varied, humid in the eastern jungles, where rain fell in abundance, dry and arid in the western plains, where the sun scorched the earth, and cool in the central highlands where kings and queens would later build their palaces. Within these landscapes, life flourished in strange and wondrous forms. Lemurs leapt between trees, their eyes glowing in the dusk. Chameleons clung to branches, changing colours with the light. Plants and creatures unknown elsewhere gave Madagascar its otherworldly aura. But the land was not empty. For centuries people had settled this island. Their origins were unusual, some from the African mainland, others from faraway Southeast Asia. Over time their cultures blended. A Malagasy identity was formed with its own languages, customs and rituals. They farmed rice in terraced paddies, raised cattle in the highlands, and told stories by the fire at night, stories of ancestors, of spirits, and of rulers who commanded both fear and respect. By the late 18th century, the island was divided into kingdoms. The most powerful of these was the Merina Kingdom, located in the central highlands. It was here on these rolling hills and fertile plateaus that kings and queens would build their courts and exert their influence over much of Madagascar. The Merina rulers were ambitious, and under their guidance, Madagascar was slowly unifying. The man who achieved much of this unity was King Andrianampoinimarina. He was clever, decisive, and ruthless when he needed to be. From his capital in the highlands, he extended his power, conquering rival clans and forging alliances. His reign brought relative stability, but it was a stability maintained by force. Every subject knew the price of disobedience. It was during this time that a young girl named Ranavalona was born. She did not come from a royal household. Her family was of humble background, ordinary people, living within the vast domain of the Merina Kingdom. Nothing in her early years suggested that she would one day become the most feared woman in the island's history. Her childhood was modest, shaped by the rhythms of rural life, planting, harvesting, tending to the daily needs of family and community. Yet fate had something extraordinary in store. Ranavalona's father, though not of noble blood, was loyal to the king. Andrianampoinimarina valued loyalty above all else, and one day that loyalty was put to the test. There was a plot to kill the king, a secret scheme that if carried out would have changed the course of Madagascar's history. Ranavalona's father discovered the plot and acted quickly. He warned the king, and in doing so, saved his life. This act of loyalty did not go unrewarded. The king, grateful for the service, drew Ranavalona's family closer to the royal court. In a world where social boundaries were rigid, this was no small gift. It elevated her family from obscurity and placed young Ranavalona on a path that led straight into the halls of power. She would be raised not just as a subject of the Merina Kingdom, but as a woman tied directly to the destiny of its rulers. As the years passed, Ranavalona entered the royal circle more fully. She was married to Prince Radema, the nephew, and chosen successor of King Andrianampoinimarina. To the young woman, this was more than a marriage. It was a transformation of her life, a leap from the simplicity of rural beginnings to the treacherous, glittering world of the palace. Life in the court was nothing like the world outside. Here alliances were fragile, loyalties shifted, and whispers carried as much weight as swords. Ranavalona learned quickly. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. She saw how words could be weapons, how silence could be strategy, and how survival depended on anticipating danger before it struck. The palace was a place of constant intrigue. Noble families vied for influence, ministers plotted behind closed doors, and even the king's favour could vanish overnight. For Ranavalona, it was both a school and a crucible. She entered as the wife of a prince, but she was becoming something more, a woman of ambition, patience, and iron will. Outside the palace walls, Madagascar itself was beginning to change. The winds of the wider world were reaching its shores. European traders sought to establish footholds. Missionaries preached new faiths. Firearms and foreign goods arrived, altering the balance of power among the island's rulers. Prince Radama, unlike his uncle, was intrigued by these foreign ways. He welcomed Western advisors, permitted missionaries to teach, and began to envision a modernized Madagascar. Ranavalona, however, was not so easily convinced. She mistrusted outsiders and their promises. To her, their presence was not a gift, but a threat, a subtle invasion that could undermine the sovereignty of her people. While Radama leaned toward reform and cooperation, Ranavalona quietly nurtured her doubts. In these early years, no one could have predicted the storm that was coming. But in the shadows of the palace, a young woman was preparing herself. She had risen from obscurity into the royal court by chance, by the loyalty of her father and the favour of a king. Yet she understood something few others grasped: power was fragile, and survival meant being ready to seize it when the moment arrived. For now, she remained the wife of Prince Radama, watchful and silent. But deep within, Ranavalona's story was only beginning. The island of Madagascar, with its jungles and mountains, its traditions and fears, was about to enter one of the darkest chapters in its history, a chapter written in her name. The early life of Ranavalona's story begins in the highlands of Madagascar, where villages dotted the slopes and rice paddies carved green terraces into the hillsides. Life in these villages followed ancient rhythms. At dawn, smoke rose from cooking fires. Children tended to cattle, and elders gathered beneath thatched roofs to discuss the day's work. For most, life was simple and predictable. But for young Ranavalona, the ordinary became extraordinary the day her family was drawn into the orbit of the royal court. Her father's loyalty to King Andrianampoinimerina had transformed the family's fate. Where once they had been commoners, now they were connected to the monarchy itself. In a society where lineage and status determined everything, this was both a blessing and a burden. It gave Ranavalona a place in the palace, but it also thrust her into a world of ambition and danger, far removed from her childhood home. As a girl, Ranavalona displayed a sharpness of mind that caught the attention of those around her. She was not known for beauty or gentleness, as courtly women often were, but for her watchful eyes and calculating silence. While other young women laughed, sang, or gossiped, Ranavalona listened. She seemed to absorb everything: the gestures of authority, the tones of command, the subtleties of persuasion. In the palace halls, where words could determine life or death, such qualities would prove invaluable. The court itself was a place of dazzling ceremony and simmering tension. Servants hurried along polished corridors, messengers carried orders sealed with the king's mark, and nobles measured their steps, carefully aware that one miscalculation could end their fortunes. In this environment, Ranavalona learned the art of survival. She saw how flattery could open doors, how suspicion could close them, and how betrayal was never far away. Her father, honoured for his service, remained close to the throne. This gave Ranavalona both protection and opportunity. She was permitted to observe the workings of power more closely than most. Though she was still young, she began to understand that leadership was not merely about strength of arms or noble blood. It was about control, fear, and the ability to act decisively when others hesitated. When she reached marriageable age, Ranavalona was chosen as a wife for Prince Radama, the king's nephew and heir. The union was more political than personal. For Radama, it strengthened his ties within the Marina elite. For Ranavalona, it was an elevation beyond imagination, from the daughter of a commoner to the consort of a future king. She entered the marriage with eyes wide open, aware of what it meant. She was stepping deeper into a web of intrigue where missteps were fatal. Prince Radama himself was a man of energy and curiosity. Younger than Ranavalona, he was ambitious in his own way, interested in the outside world, fascinated by new ideas, eager to modernize his kingdom. He surrounded himself with foreigners, advisors and missionaries convinced that Madagascar could rise by learning from Europe. For Ranavalona, this was both puzzling and troubling. She respected her husband's intelligence, but she distrusted his enthusiasm for outsiders. Their marriage was not marked by warmth. Radama had many other wives, and Ranavalona was only one among them. She did not become his favourite, nor did she bear him children. But if her place in his heart was uncertain, her place in the palace was secure. She watched him build connections with foreign powers, and she silently weighed what this would mean for her own future. Outside the palace, whispers of change grew louder. Missionaries preached to villagers, teaching them to read and write in new scripts introducing the Christian faith. Some Malagasy embraced these teachings, seeing in them a path to knowledge and progress. Others resisted, fearing the loss of tradition. Ranavalona even then aligned herself with the skeptics. She saw Christianity not as a spiritual offering, but as a wedge driven into her people's culture, one that could loosen the foundations of Marina rule. Her skepticism was reinforced by her own nature. Ranavalona was cautious, proud, and deeply attached to the idea of sovereignty. The thought of foreigners teaching her people, guiding their beliefs, and altering their customs stirred in her a sense of alarm. She may not have had power yet, but she was already forming the convictions that would define her reign. Madagascar must remain Malagasy untouched by the influence of outsiders. As she grew older, Ranavalona's reputation within the palace solidified. She was known less for charm than for resolve. Some whispered that she was cold, others that she was clever. Few could predict how far her ambition would reach, but all sensed that she was not a woman to be underestimated. She had patience, and in a court where power shifted like sand, patience could be the most dangerous quality of all. By the time Radama ascended the throne as King Radamatha, Ranavalona was firmly established as one of his queens. She stood at his side during ceremonies, observed the rituals of the court, and watched as the kingdom opened itself to the world beyond its shores. To most she was a quiet presence, overshadowed by the young king's charisma and vision. But beneath that quiet exterior, Ranavalona was absorbing every lesson the palace had to offer. No one at the time could have foreseen what was to come. Radama was strong, energetic, and determined to rule. The future seemed to belong to him. Yet fate has its twists. His reign would not last long, and when it ended, the silent queen who had stood in his shadow would step forward into the light. Ranavalona's early life was marked by transformation from a humble child to a royal consort, from obscurity to proximity to power. Each step prepared her, hardened her, and sharpened her instincts. She learned to trust no one completely, to value survival above affection, and to wait until the moment was right. When that moment arrived, she would not hesitate, for now she remained the quiet queen, watchful and often overlooked. But history was already moving toward her. The death of a king would change everything, and Ranavalona, patient, ambitious and unyielding, would seize the opportunity. Marriage to Prince Radami. The marriage of Ranavalona to Prince Radama was more than a union between two individuals. It was a weaving of threads into the fabric of power. For Ranavalona, born of humble origins, it marked the peak of social elevation. For Radama, heir to the Marina throne, it was one alliance among many in a kingdom where rulers were expected to take multiple wives, strengthening ties across noble families and securing loyalty from different clans. Their marriage was never one of passion. Radama was younger than Ranavalona, restless and ambitious, with a mind eager for change. He enjoyed the company of many women, and Ranavalona was but one among a large retinue of wives and concubines. She did not hold his heart, nor did she give him heirs. But what she lacked in intimacy, she gained in proximity. She was in the palace at the centre of power, watching as Radama prepared to shape the destiny of Madagascar. Radama came to the throne in 1810, inheriting the legacy of his uncle, King Andrianampoini Marina. Where the old king had consolidated power through conquest and discipline, Radama sought to expand influence through modernization. He believed that Madagascar could no longer remain isolated. The world was changing and the island had to change with it. He welcomed European traders and envoys, inviting them to his court. He permitted Christian missionaries to establish schools and teach literacy, using the Roman alphabet to record the Malagasy language. He sent envoys abroad to seek recognition of his rule, hoping to be seen as a sovereign equal by the powers of Europe. Under Radama, Madagascar began to stir with new ideas, new tools and new influences. For many, this was a time of hope. To some nobles, the arrival of European firearms promised stronger armies. To commoners, the introduction of new crafts and skills offered opportunities beyond subsistence farming. To converts, Christianity brought a new sense of faith and identity. But to Ranavalona, this opening to the world was a dangerous gamble. She had been raised with a deep respect for the traditions of her people, for the spirits of the ancestors, for the customs that bound the Malagasy together. To her, the missionaries were not simply teaching children to read. They were reshaping their souls. The traders were not merely exchanging goods, they were binding the kingdom to foreign powers. The more she watched Radama embrace the West, the more she withdrew into silence, her doubts hardening into conviction. At court she said little. She was never Radama's confidant, never the voice that guided his reforms, yet she observed everything. She saw which nobles supported his policies and which resisted them. She saw how the missionaries gained influence over students, how villagers were drawn to the new faith, and how some courtiers whispered uneasily about the erosion of their traditions. Ranavalona stored these observations quietly, like a hunter storing arrows for the day of the hunt. Their personal relationship remained cool, even distant. Radama favoured younger wives, more pliant companions, women who reflected his energy and enthusiasm. Ranavalona was older, reserved, and stern. She rarely smiled, rarely softened. Her demeanour was one of a watchfulness rather than warmth. Some described her as cold, others as calculating. Whatever the truth, she was not the queen who shared Radama's heart. And yet fate has its paradoxes. It was precisely because she was overlooked, precisely because she was not central to Radama's affections, that Ranavalona survived the turbulent years of his reign. She was neither too close to his reforms to be tied to their failures, nor too distant to be excluded from the court. She occupied a middle ground, present, silent, enduring. As the years passed, Radama's reign grew heavier with the strain of his ambitions. He fought wars to expand marina dominance, pushing the borders of the kingdom outward. He negotiated with foreign envoys seeking recognition and advantage. He placed his trust in advisers who urged him toward reform, while factions within the court grew restless under the pressure of change. The young king's health began to falter. He drank heavily, and his strength waned. For Ranavalona, these were years of quiet preparation. She bore no children, and by all rights she had no claim to the succession. The throne should have passed to another branch of the royal family. Yet Ranavalona knew that in times of uncertainty rules could be bent, traditions overturned, and power seized by those bold enough to act. She studied the factions of the court with care. She knew which generals might be swayed, which nobles might be eliminated, which ministers might turn their coats when the moment arrived. She was patient, knowing that the king's life was fragile, and that one day soon his death would plunge the kingdom into crisis. To the world outside, she remained the silent queen, a figure of little importance compared to Radama's vision of modernity. To those within the palace, she was a presence to be noted but not feared, a consort among many. Few realized that beneath her stillness lay ambition, and beneath her silence a will of iron. By the late 1820s, whispers of the king's declining health spread through the palace. He was not yet old, but his body bore the weight of exhaustion and excess. Courtiers speculated about the future, about which heir would succeed, about how the balance of power would shift. Ranavalona listened to these whispers with keen ears. She understood that the death of Radama would open the gates to chaos, and that chaos was opportunity. Their marriage had never been close, but it had given her everything she needed: a place in the palace, a view of power, and a deep knowledge of the currents that ran beneath the surface of the marina court. When the end came for Radama, Ranavalona would be ready, for now she remained in the shadows, the overlooked queen. But destiny was moving toward her step by step, drawing her closer to the throne. The marriage that had never been one of love would nevertheless prove to be the turning point of her life, the doorway through which she would step into history as one of the most ruthless rulers the island had ever known. King Radama came in the opening of Madagascar. When Radama ascended the throne in 1810, he was young, energetic, and eager to rule. He inherited from his uncle Andrianampoinimarina a kingdom that was strong, united, and feared by its rivals. But Radama wanted more than just stability. He dreamed of greatness, of transforming Madagascar from an isolated island kingdom into a modern state recognized by the great powers of the world. He had grown up listening to tales of European exploration of empires that spanned oceans of nations whose armies were armed with weapons far beyond what the Malagasy possessed. He had seen the ships that docked along the coasts, bringing goods from lands as distant as England, France, and Portugal. Where others saw danger in these encounters, Radama saw possibility. Almost immediately he began to open his court to foreign influence. He welcomed envoys from Britain, the most powerful naval empire of the age. He agreed to treaties establishing diplomatic recognition that marked Madagascar as more than a distant island. It was now a partner, however cautious, in the affairs of nations. For Radama, this recognition was more than symbolic. It meant legitimacy, and legitimacy was the foundation of his dream. The king was fascinated by European learning. He allowed missionaries from the London Missionary Society to settle in his lands. They were permitted to build schools where they taught children to read and write, but this was no simple importation of foreign culture. Radama insisted that the Malagasy language itself be written down. Until then, it had been an oral tradition, passed from generation to generation through speech and song. Now, with the Roman alphabet, the missionaries began to record Malagasy words, creating books, primers, and even translations of the Bible. The idea thrilled Radama. A literate kingdom could be an enduring one. Knowledge once fragile and fleeting could be preserved. He saw in education a path to strength, and he believed that by embracing Western knowledge, his people would be better prepared to stand on equal footing with the powers of Europe. But if the king was exhilarated, many within his court were unsettled. Nobles who had long relied on oral tradition and ancestral authority viewed literacy as a double-edged sword. What if foreign ideas undermined the authority of the monarchy? What if Christianity weakened the sacred rituals that bound the people together? These doubts simmered quietly, and among those who harboured them was Queen Ranavalona. She watched as the missionaries taught the children of nobles. She observed how villagers began to adopt new prayers, new customs, and even new moral codes. To her it was as though the foundations of Malagasy identity were being rewritten. The ancestors, once the guiding spirits of daily life, were being pushed aside for a god from a distant land. The changes did not stop at religion and education. Radama sought to modernize his army. He entered agreements with the British, who supplied him with firearms, gunpowder, and military instructors. Malagasy soldiers began to march in formation trained in the styles of European armies. The king's forces became stronger, more disciplined, and better armed than those of his rivals. With these improvements, Radama launched campaigns beyond the Central Highlands, extending his influence across much of Madagascar. His ambition was to unify the entire island under Marina rule. For centuries, Madagascar had been divided among rival kingdoms, each with its own rulers, traditions, and strengths. Radama believed it was his destiny to bring them all under one crown. His conquests were brutal. Armies marched across the land, villages were forced to submit, and captives were brought back as slaves. But to Radama, this was the price of nation-building. In the palace, the atmosphere was one of transformation. Foreign advisors moved through its corridors. Missionaries held audiences with the king. Artisans introduced new tools, new crafts, new ways of thinking. It was a world in motion, and Radama thrived in it. But Ranavalona did not. She stood apart, silent, but observant. She was not opposed to strength. Indeed, she valued it above all things. But she did not believe that strength should come from outsiders. To her, every gift from the missionaries, every shipment of guns, every lesson written in a foreign script was a seed of dependence, and dependence was the path to weakness. Her doubts grew stronger as Christianity spread among the people. The missionaries taught that all were equal before God, that no man or woman was above another. This teaching, radical in its simplicity, clashed with the rigid hierarchies of Marina society. If the king's authority came from the ancestors, what would happen if people turned instead to the Christian God? Would they still obey the monarchy? Would they still fear the rituals that had bound them for generations? Ranavalona understood the danger with clarity. The missionaries may have spoken of salvation, but she heard subversion. She saw not the promise of heaven, but the erosion of sovereignty. Where Radama saw opportunity, Ranavalona saw invasion not with swords and muskets, but with ideas that could not easily be undone. Their differences were not spoken openly, but they hung in the air between them. Radama pressed forward with his vision, while Ranavalona folded her skepticism into silence. He was a king eager for reform. She was a queen waiting for her moment. As the 1820s unfolded, Madagascar became a kingdom of contradictions. In the capital, children recited lessons in newly printed books. Soldiers marched with foreign weapons. Envoys carried letters to Europe seeking recognition and trade. Yet beyond the highlands, in the villages and rice fields, life remained much the same. Farmers still prayed to the ancestors, healers still worked with charms and rituals, and elders still told stories by firelight. Two worlds existed side by side, the ancient and the new, the Malagasy and the foreign. Radama believed he could balance them, weaving them together into a stronger fabric. But in doing so, he underestimated the resistance that simmered beneath the surface. He underestimated the doubts of his courtiers, the unease of his nobles, and the quiet resolve of his queen. Ranavalona watched as her husband's health declined, worn down by drink and the burdens of rule. She watched as factions formed, each vying for influence, each calculating what might happen if the king were to die. She knew that the kingdom was fragile, held together by the force of one man's vision. And she knew that when that man was gone, the struggle for power would be fierce. In the twilight of Radama's reign, the opening of Madagascar to the world seemed irreversible. But in the shadows of the palace, Ranavalona was preparing for a very different future. Where he had looked outward, she would look inward. Where he had sought progress through foreign ways, she would demand strength through tradition. And where he had courted the approval of outsiders, she would banish them with fire and blood. The stage was set. The king had opened Madagascar. Soon the queen would close it. The death of Radama I and the succession crisis. By the late 1820s, the promise of King Radama's reforms was dimming. The young monarch, once so full of energy and vision, was weakening. His health had been eroded by long campaigns, political stress, and his indulgence in alcohol. At first, whispers of his decline were spoken only in hushed tones, but as the months passed, they could no longer be hidden. In the palace, servants carried their duties with lowered eyes. Courtiers spoke more carefully, and nobles began to calculate their futures. Everyone knew the king would not live much longer. Radama had no legitimate heir. Despite his many wives and concubines, none had given him a child who could inherit the throne. This left a dangerous void. According to custom, succession could pass to another member of the royal family, perhaps a brother, a nephew, or even a distant cousin of noble blood. But custom was only a guide, and in a court where ambition ran deep, such rules were fragile. The question of who would rule after Radama was not just a matter of tradition, it was a matter of survival. Ranavalona had long anticipated this moment. She had no son to claim the throne, no direct right to rule. On paper, she was only one of many wives overshadowed by others who were younger, more favoured, or more politically connected. But Ranavalona possessed something more powerful than lineage. She possessed patience calculation, and a network of loyal allies quietly gathered over years of observation. She had cultivated relationships with key figures in the court and the military men who commanded soldiers, and could act decisively in times of crisis. She had won the trust of those who were wary of foreign influence, those who feared that Radama's opening to Europe threatened the very fabric of Malagasy identity. To them, Ranavalona represented tradition, stability, and resistance against the encroaching world. When King Radama finally died in 1828, the palace erupted into uncertainty. News of his passing spread quickly, and with it panic. Factions formed at once, each pressing its claim, each whispering names of potential successors. Nobles huddled in chambers weighing alliances, while soldiers stood restless in the courtyards awaiting orders. It was a moment when hesitation could mean defeat, and boldness could mean triumph. Ranavalona was ready. She moved swiftly, calling upon the generals and guards she had quietly courted. She invoked the memory of Radama's uncle Andrianam Poinimarina, and his promise of reward to her father for saving his life years before. That promise, she argued, bound the royal line to her own. She was not merely a consort, she was the chosen protector of the dynasty. The logic was thin, but in times of chaos, logic mattered less than force. Ranavalona's allies acted decisively. Potential rivals were seized and executed. Ministers who opposed her claim were silenced, some dragged into the courtyards to meet swift and bloody ends. Those who hesitated quickly pledged allegiance, realizing that survival lay in bending to her will. The succession crisis became a purge. Nobles loyal to other claimants were cut down. Radama's nephews, who might have made legitimate heirs, were eliminated one by one. The palace that had once echoed with debate and ceremony now trembled with fear. Within days, Ranavalona had transformed uncertainty into control. Her coronation followed soon after. In the capital of Antananarivo, she was declared Queen Ranavalona, sovereign of Madagascar. The ceremonies honoured the ancestors, affirming that the spirits themselves had approved her reign. Drums thundered, singers raised their voices, and soldiers stood in solemn formation. Yet beneath the pageantry lay a truth that all understood. Ranavalona had seized the throne not through tradition, but through ruthlessness. For many, her ascension was shocking. She had never been Radama's favourite, never the queen who seemed destined for greatness. Yet she had outmaneuvered them all. By the force of her will and the swiftness of her strike, she had claimed the crown of Madagascar. Her first acts as queen set the tone for her rule. She ordered the execution of lingering rivals, ensuring that no claimant could rise against her. She rewarded the soldiers and generals who had supported her, binding their loyalty with gifts and honours. And she began to speak openly against the influence of foreigners, signalling that the policies of her late husband would not continue unchallenged. The people of Madagascar, especially those in the capital, looked upon their new queen with a mixture of awe and dread. She was a woman who had stepped from the shadows into absolute power, a ruler who had proven willing to shed blood to secure her throne. Some admired her strength, believing she would protect the kingdom from foreign domination. Others feared her ruthlessness, sensing that her reign would be marked by violence and suspicion. For Ranavalona herself, the coronation was not the end of a struggle, it was the beginning. She had claimed the throne, but she knew how fragile power could be. Her rule would have to be defended not just against foreign influence, but against the ambitions of her own nobles, ministers, and generals. She would need to rule with iron or risk being overthrown. In the months that followed, Madagascar braced for transformation. The missionaries who had flourished under Radama looked anxiously to the queen, uncertain of their fate. European envoys who had once been welcomed at court now found doors closing. Within the kingdom, nobles who had hoped for continuity instead faced a ruler determined to chart a different path. The death of Radama had ended an era of openness. The succession crisis had revealed the sharpness of Ranavalona's will. And now, as she settled into her throne, Madagascar stood at the edge of a new chapter, one that would be darker, harsher, and far more terrifying than the one before. Ranavalona had survived the storm of succession. Now she would turn her gaze outward, and her enemies within and beyond the island would come to know the full measure of her rule. Ascension to the throne. The year was 1828, and the highland capital of Antananarivo lay heavy with uncertainty. The death of King Radama thus had thrown the kingdom into confusion, but out of that confusion one figure had risen with startling swiftness, Queen Ranavalona the Fair. Her claim to the throne had been secured not by birthright or by popular will, but by the cold logic of survival and the iron hand of force. In the days after Radama's death, the palace grounds had run with blood. Nobles loyal to other branches of the royal family had been seized and executed. Potential rivals, including Radama's nephews, who might have been groomed for succession, were cut down before they could rally support. Even ministers who merely hesitated to pledge loyalty were dragged into the courtyards and silenced forever. It was a purge as decisive as it was brutal, leaving no question about who now controlled Madagascar. When at last the ceremonies of coronation were held, they bore the grandeur of tradition. High on the sacred hills of Antananarivo, beneath the watchful eyes of ancestors and nobles, Ranavalona was declared sovereign. Drums thundered, voices rose in chants, and ritual blessings were performed to bind her rule with the will of the spirits. To the people gathered, the coronation was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. A woman now sat upon the throne, a woman whose rise had been as swift as it was bloody. For Ranavalona, the rituals were more than pageantry. She understood the deep importance of legitimacy in the eyes of her subjects. By invoking the spirits of the ancestors, she cloaked her seizure of power in the sacred mantle of tradition. Whatever violence had accompanied her ascent, it was now framed as destiny. The ancestors themselves, it was proclaimed, had chosen her to rule, but ceremonies could not erase the truth her hold on power was fragile. The throne of Madagascar was surrounded by enemies both within and beyond. At court, factions remained restless. Nobles who had lost relatives in the purge simmered with resentment, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Generals who had helped her to power now expected rewards, and their loyalty could shift if they felt neglected. The missionaries once protected by Radama were uneasy under the gaze of a queen who mistrusted them, and across the seas European powers watched closely, judging how the island's new ruler might alter the balance of influence. Ranavalona understood the precariousness of her position. She had seized power with ruthlessness. Now she would rule with the same. From the very beginning of her reign, she established two guiding principles. Loyalty would be rewarded, and disobedience would be crushed. Those who bent to her authority could thrive under her rule. Those who defied it would meet swift destruction. One of her first acts as queen was to secure her military base. She lavished gifts upon the officers who had supported her claim, ensuring that their loyalty was bound not only by fear, but by tangible reward. She also strengthened her control over the royal guards, the soldiers stationed within the capital, making sure that her person was always protected. In a kingdom as volatile as Madagascar, survival began with command of the sword. At the same time, Ranavalona began to distance herself from the policies of her late husband. Where Adama had welcomed foreigners, Ranavalona cast them in a different light. She saw the missionaries not as allies but as interlopers spreading ideas that undermined the authority of the monarchy. She saw the treaties with Europeans not as partnerships, but as snares that threatened to entangle Madagascar independency. Quietly at first, but then with growing firmness, she signalled that her reign would not follow Radama's path of openness. Her message to the world was simple: Madagascar would remain Malagasy. Its traditions, its sovereignty, its way of life, these would not be surrendered to outsiders, no matter their promises. For her subjects, this stance was both reassuring and terrifying. Many nobles, suspicious of the influence of Christianity, welcomed the Queen's determination to preserve ancestral customs. They saw in her a defender of tradition, a ruler who would protect the sacred balance between people and spirits. But others feared her zeal, for they knew that resistance to change could easily become oppression. Indeed, in the first months of her reign, Ranavalona began to cultivate an aura of fear. She made it known that she was watching that nothing escaped her attention. Accusations of treason or disloyalty were met with swift punishments. Trials, when they occurred at all, were often symbolic decisions were made in advance, outcomes foreordained. Those who spoke against her vanished, leaving their families to mourn in silence. Yet Ranavalona was not without political skill. She knew how to play factions against each other, balancing the ambitions of generals and ministers, so that none could grow too powerful. She rewarded loyalty with land, cattle, or influence, creating a system where survival depended on obedience. In doing so, she built a fragile but effective web of control, one that would allow her to rule unchallenged for decades. Her rise to power also carried symbolic weight. A woman on the throne was unusual but not unheard of in Malagasy tradition. By invoking the authority of the ancestors, Ranavalona positioned herself as a mother of the nation, fierce in her protection and merciless in her discipline. In her vision, she was not merely ruling for herself, but safeguarding the very soul of Madagascar from foreign corruption. Still beneath the surface of her coronation lay unease. The purge that had secured her throne had left scars. Families who had lost sons, brothers or fathers to her wrath whispered in bitterness. Missionaries sensing hostility prayed for protection, and across the waters European envoys reported back to their governments with caution. Madagascar's new queen was not like her predecessor. She was fierce, suspicious, and unyielding. As the drums of coronation faded and the ceremonies ended, the people of Madagascar settled into life under their new queen. Some felt relief, believing she would protect them from the foreign faiths and influences that had unsettled the kingdom. Others felt dread, sensing that her reign would bring hardship and blood. All, however, recognized the truth: Ranavalona, I was not a ruler to be defied. In the years to come, her name would become synonymous with cruelty, isolation, and fear. But in those first months of her reign, she was simply a queen who had taken what she believed was hers, determined to hold it with iron hands. The throne was hers, and she would never let it go. Policies against foreign influence. From the moment Ranavalona secured her throne, she turned her gaze upon those who had thrived under King Radama III's rule: the missionaries, the traders, the envoys, and the Malagasy nobles who had welcomed their presence. To her, these outsiders and their allies represented not opportunity but danger. They were seeds of foreign control capable of taking root and choking the sovereignty of her people. At first, her suspicion was expressed in subtle gestures. Audiences with missionaries were delayed or denied. Foreign visitors found themselves kept waiting for days before gaining permission to speak with her. Traders discovered that the once open channels of commerce now came with added restrictions and higher taxes. What had once been an eager welcome under Adama became a cautious distance under Ranavalona. The Queen spoke often of the ancestors. She declared that Madagascar's strength came not from the tools or teachings of Europe, but from its own traditions. The rituals, the offerings, the prayers to the spirits, these she insisted were the foundation of life. Christianity, with its foreign god and foreign morals, was not only unnecessary but dangerous. It eroded the authority of the monarchy by teaching equality before God, and it weakened the connection between the living and the dead upon which Malagasy society was built. In speeches before her court, Ranavalona warned that missionaries were not simply teachers, but agents of subversion, They dress as friends, she declared, but they would make us servants. Her words struck a chord with many nobles who feared that their own authority over their people could be threatened if Christianity spread further. For them, the Queen's resistance was not only a defence of tradition, but a defence of their own power. Her policies soon hardened. Missionary schools, once bustling with students, came under scrutiny. Teachers were questioned about what they taught, and lessons deemed too foreign were forbidden. Printing presses, which had begun to produce books in the Malagasy language, were monitored and at times shut down. The Bible itself, translated into Malagasy, became a source of controversy. To Ranavalona, it was not a holy text, but a symbol of foreign influence, a threat disguised in sacred words. Trade, too, became more tightly controlled. While Radama had courted agreements with European powers, Ranavalona placed restrictions on their activities. Foreign merchants were permitted to operate, but only under strict oversight. Licenses were expensive, taxes were heavy, and those who broke the rules risked confiscation or imprisonment. By tightening her grip on commerce, she ensured that wealth flowed through her hands, not through foreign ones. Diplomatic relations grew tense. Envoys from Britain and France reported increasing difficulties in dealing with the Queen. She was polite when she chose to be, but her suspicion was unmistakable. Promises made one day were reversed the next. Negotiations dragged endlessly, leaving Europeans frustrated and wary. Slowly it became clear that Madagascar was closing itself off, retreating from the world that Radama had so eagerly embraced. For the missionaries, the change was devastating. Many had believed that Madagascar would be the great triumph of their efforts in Africa, a land where Christianity would spread across an entire nation. Under Radama, they had taught hundreds of students, trained artisans, and translated religious texts. Now, under Ranavalona, their work was stifled at every turn. Some were expelled outright. Others remained, but only under constant threat. Their converts faced suspicion, harassment, and increasingly punishment. Ranavalona's resistance was not only spiritual or political, it was also deeply personal. She remembered how Radama had favoured the missionaries, how he had trusted them with influence in his court. To her, they were reminders of a past she had overturned symbols of a husband whose vision had opposed her own. In rejecting them, she was also rejecting Radama's legacy, and asserting her independence as a ruler in her own right. Yet her policies were not without consequence. By restricting trade, she limited the flow of European goods, including weapons and tools that had strengthened her kingdom. By alienating missionaries, she risked angering the powerful nations that supported them. British officials in particular began to view Ranavalona as hostile, a queen who could not be reasoned with. This perception would shape the tense and often hostile relations between Madagascar and Europe throughout her reign. Still within Madagascar, her actions won her support. Many nobles praised her for defending the old ways. Commoners who feared the unfamiliar teachings of Christianity felt reassured by her protection of ancestral traditions. Even those who resented her harshness could not deny her strength. She was a queen who stood firm against the world, refusing to bow before foreign powers. The missionaries, however, did not give up easily. Some continued their work in secret teaching converts, quietly holding prayers in hidden gatherings, and smuggling religious texts into the countryside. To them, the Queen's resistance was a trial of faith, a test of their commitment. To Ranavalona, it was defiance, and defiance demanded punishment. Over time, suspicion hardened into persecution. Converts to Christianity were denounced as traitors to their culture. Families were torn apart, communities divided. Trials were held where accused converts were forced to renounce their faith or face exile, enslavement, or death. The Queen's determination to root out foreign influence became not only policy but obsession, and yet Ranavalona saw herself not as cruel but as protective. To her, she was safeguarding the soul of Madagascar. She believed that without firm resistance, her kingdom would be swallowed by outsiders, reduced to a colony like so many others across Africa. Harshness was necessary, she argued, for survival. Thus, in the early years of her reign, the path was set. Where Radama had opened the doors of Madagascar to the world, Ranavalona slammed them shut. Where he had embraced missionaries, she drove them away. Where he had sought recognition from foreign powers, she demanded independence at any cost. The Queen had drawn her battle lines, and the struggle between Madagascar and the foreign world had begun. The reign of terror and purges. If Queen Ranavalona's coronation had been marked by blood, her reign soon became defined by it. From the very beginning, she ruled not through affection, or persuasion, but through fear. For her fear was not a weakness. It was a tool sharper than any blade, stronger than any fortress. To rule Madagascar, she believed, was to command obedience through terror. The purges that had begun with Radama's death did not end with her coronation. Instead, they deepened. Ranavalona was convinced that rivals lurked everywhere among nobles, among soldiers, even among servants in her own palace. Anyone who might question her authority was a potential enemy, and enemies had to be removed before they had the chance to act. Her methods were swift and merciless. Accusations of treason could be made on the thinnest grounds. A whispered rumour, a suspicious glance, an unguarded word. Once accused, few survived. Trials, if they were held at all, were less about justice than spectacle. Witnesses were summoned, questions asked, but the verdict was rarely in doubt. Conviction was almost certain, and the punishment was almost always death. Executions became a grim rhythm of life at court. Some were carried out quietly, prisoners strangled in their cells or speared in courtyards at dawn. Others were public, intended to send a message. Nobles accused of disloyalty were paraded before crowds, bound and humiliated before being speared or hurled from cliffs. Families were forced to watch their grief turned into warning for all who witnessed. One of the Queen's most infamous tools was the Tangina ordeal. This ancient trial by poison had long existed in Madagascar, but under Ranavalona it became widespread, even systematic. Those accused of crimes, whether theft, sorcery or treason, were forced to swallow a potion brewed from the poisonous Tangina nut. Survival was taken as proof of innocence. Death was proof of guilt. Of course, most did not survive. By some estimates, tens of thousands perished through this ordeal during her reign. To Ranavalona, the Tangina ordeal was more than punishment. It was a ritual affirmation of justice, a way to bind her rule to the will of the ancestors. By leaving life and death in the hands of fate, she cloaked executions in the language of tradition. But to her people it was terror made flesh. Anyone could be accused, and once accused, few escaped the deadly drink. Fear spread beyond the palace into the villages. Ordinary Malagasy knew that a careless word against the Queen, a private criticism or even association with the wrong people could lead to accusation. Neighbours distrusted one another. Families guarded their speech. Suspicion became a constant companion, and silence was often the only protection. Yet Ranavalona thrived on this climate. To her, fear meant control. So long as her subjects trembled, they would obey. The Queen also extended her purges into the military. Generals who had supported her rise to power were richly rewarded, but even they were not safe. If a commander's loyalty wavered, if his popularity grew too strong, if whispers suggested he might dream of seizing the throne, he too could be destroyed. Ranavalona balanced her officers carefully, ensuring that none grew powerful enough to threaten her. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly. Suspicion was punished brutally. In the court, ministers learned to speak carefully. To advise the Queen was dangerous, for advice could be interpreted as criticism. Many chose silence, agreeing with her words even when they disagreed in their hearts. Those who dared to oppose her openly were swiftly eliminated. The court became a theatre of obedience where smiles hid fear and praise disguised resentment. But Ranavalona did not act only out of paranoia. Each purge served a purpose. By removing rivals, she solidified her rule. By terrifying nobles, she ensured their obedience. By invoking the ancestors and the Tangina ordeal, she presented her cruelty as tradition, making it difficult to challenge without also challenging the sacred customs of the people. Her violence was not random, it was calculated. The missionaries too began to feel the sting of her terror. Converts to Christianity were singled out, accused not only of betraying tradition, but of betraying their queen. Many were forced to endure the Tangina ordeal, others were executed outright. Churches were shuttered, gatherings broken apart, and secret worship punished with exile or slavery. Ranavalona made it clear allegiance to the Christian God was disobedience to her, and yet amid the blood and fear the Queen cultivated an image of herself as the defender of Madagascar. She presented her purges not as cruelty, but as necessity. She claimed she was protecting her people from corruption, from treason, from foreign enslavement. In her own eyes, she was not a tyrant but a guardian, fierce and uncompromising. For many commoners, especially those far from the capital, this image held some truth. They saw that Madagascar remained free from colonial rule, while neighbouring lands fell under European control. They saw that their queen resisted the missionaries who sought to change their ways of life. To them, her harshness was frightening, but her strength was also reassuring. Still, the toll of her purges was immense. Tens of thousands perished either by execution poison or forced labour. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, traditions twisted into instruments of fear. Ranavalona had built a fortress of power, but its walls were mortared with blood. By the end of the 1830s, her reign had taken on a rhythm of terror. Accusation, trial, ordeal, execution, these became the heartbeat of her court. Survival meant silence, obedience, and unshakable loyalty. To live under Ranavalona was to live in constant fear of a queen whose wrath could fall at any time upon anyone. Yet in this reign of terror she remained unchallenged. No noble dared rise against her. No general risked mutiny. No missionary could openly defy her. Through violence and fear, she had carved out a rule as absolute as any monarch in Madagascar's history. The queen had shown her people the cost of disobedience. Soon she would show them the cost of ambition through vast projects of labour that tested the limits of her nation's strength and endurance. Forced labour and grand projects. As Queen Ranavalona tightened her grip on Madagascar, her vision for the kingdom expanded beyond the walls of her palace. She did not intend merely to defend her throne. She intended to shape the land itself, to leave monuments and roads that would speak of her power for generations. But the price of these ambitions would be paid not by her, but by her people. The Queen revived and expanded a system known as Fanampona obligatory service to the Crown. In principle, it was a long-standing Malagasy tradition, where subjects owed labour to their rulers as a sign of loyalty. Under Ranavalona, however, it grew into something vast and merciless. Entire communities were summoned to toil for the Queen's projects, sometimes for months at a time. Men, women, and even children were pulled from their villages and forced into labour gangs, leaving their fields untended, their families hungry, and their lives at risk. The most notorious of these endeavours was the construction of roads across the rugged highlands. Ranavalona wanted her armies to move swiftly, her messages to travel without delay, and her authority to extend to the farthest corners of the island. To achieve this, she ordered thousands of workers to carve paths through forests, over mountains, and across rivers. With only primitive tools and bare hands, they hacked their way through unforgiving terrain. The work was brutal. Sun blazed on their backs during the day. Cold winds bit their skin at night. Food was scarce, shelter almost non-existent. Disease spread easily among the camps, and accidents claimed many lives. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others from hunger. It was said that on certain stretches of road the number of dead was so great that corpses were left unburied by the roadside grim markers of the Queen's relentless will. And yet the roads were built. Kilometres of stone and dirt carved through the wilderness, binding the kingdom together. They stood as proof of Ranavalona's determination, but also as monuments to suffering. Her ambitions extended beyond roads. She demanded palaces worthy of her reign. One of her most famous projects was the Grand Palace on the sacred hill of Antananarivo, built with the forced labour of thousands. Massive wooden beams were hauled from distant forests, stone foundations laid with sweat and blood. The palace rose as a symbol of royal majesty, its size and position proclaiming her dominance over the land. But behind its walls lay stories of misery. Workers toiled under cruel overseers, beaten if they slowed, starved if they faltered. Many never returned home. To their families, the palace was not a symbol of pride, but a tomb built from the lives of their loved ones. Fanampona did not stop at construction. It bled into every corner of life. Fields had to be cultivated for the crown. Forest cleared goods transported, and military campaigns supplied, all through forced labour. The burden fell heaviest on the poor who could not pay to avoid service. For them, Fanampana was a sentence that stole their time, their health, and often their lives. The Queen, however, saw it differently. To her, Fanampana was not cruelty but duty. Every subject owed service to the monarch just as the monarch owed protection to the people. In her mind, the labour she demanded was a sacred obligation rooted in tradition and necessary for the survival of the kingdom. Without roads, without palaces, without a disciplined system of service, how could Madagascar remain strong against foreign threats? Yet the toll on her people was undeniable. Villages left without men to farm suffered poor harvests. Families starved while their fathers and sons laboured on distant projects. Diseases spread in work camps and then returned with the survivors to their homes. The population of Madagascar began to decline, weakened not only by executions and poison trials, but by the grinding weight of forced labour. Foreigners who witnessed these conditions were horrified. Missionaries and traders reported back to Europe tales of suffering that shocked even hardened listeners. Some compared the Queen's rule to slavery, pointing to the endless streams of workers dragged from their homes. Others spoke of it as worse than slavery, for at least a slave owner had some incentive to keep his labourers alive. Ranavalona, they said, demanded bodies without care for whether they survived. Still, there was a strange paradox in her projects. Though they were built on suffering, they also forged a stronger state. The roads did make her army more mobile, allowing her to crush uprisings and defend her kingdom's borders. The palaces did project an image of power that impressed visitors and reinforced her authority at home. Fanampoana drained her people, but it also made her rule possible. In the villages, people whispered of the Queen's relentless demands. Some cursed her, calling her cruel and heartless. Others feared her, believing she was guided by spirits who demanded such sacrifice. A few, however, saw in her projects a twisted kind of greatness. They looked at the roads, the palaces, the growing reach of the monarchy, and thought only a ruler of immense strength could command such feats. But strength came at a cost. Every road was paved with bones, every palace built on the backs of the dying. The people of Madagascar were bound not only to their queen, but to her insatiable hunger for monuments and control. By the late 1830s, Fanampoana had become an inescapable reality. To be Malagasy under Ranavalona was to live under the shadow of summons, never knowing when the Queen's demand for labour would tear you from your home. It was a life of endurance, of quiet suffering, and of survival in the face of relentless obligation. And still the Queen was not finished. Roads and palaces were only the beginning. Soon she would turn her attention to the greatest threat of all the foreigners who refused to accept her authority. To deal with them, she would unleash not only her armies, but the full weight of her obsession with isolation and control. Everyday life under Ranavalona. For the ordinary people of Madagascar, life under Queen Ranavalona was not lived in palaces or among nobles, but in small villages scattered across the highlands and forests. Here, amid fields of rice and hills thick with mist, men and women tried to survive beneath the long shadow of a queen whose reach extended into every corner of their existence. At first glance, daily life seemed unchanged. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their rice paddies, women pounded grain and wove cloth, children played in the dusty lanes of their villages. The cycle of planting and harvest, of births and deaths, of feasts and rituals, all continued as they had for generations. But beneath this familiar rhythm was a constant undercurrent of fear, for no one was free from the Queen's demands. The most dreaded of these demands was Fanampoana, the forced labour that touched nearly every household. At any moment a messenger from the capital might arrive with orders. Men would be summoned to build roads, carry stones, or join military expeditions. Women were required to prepare food, weave clothing, or transport supplies. Even children could be pressed into service. Whole villages were emptied, left behind in silence as their people marched off to serve the crown. For those left behind, survival was difficult. Fields went untended, harvests failed, and families went hungry. Many died, not in the work camps themselves, but at home from starvation or disease brought back by the labourers. It was said that under Ranavalona even the strongest family could be broken by a single summons. Religion and ritual became a refuge. Malagasy traditions placed immense importance on the ancestors who were believed to watch over the living. Families offered prayers and sacrifices, hoping the spirits might shield them from misfortune. The Tangina ordeal, which terrified so many, was also woven into the fabric of belief. Some accepted its deadly verdicts as the will of the ancestors, even as others whispered of injustice. Christian converts, however, lived under constant danger. To embrace the foreign god was to invite suspicion. Secret gatherings were held in forests or hidden homes where hymns were sung softly, Bibles read by flickering lamplight. Discovery could mean punishment, exile, or death. Yet faith persisted, passed in whispers from one believer to another. Their resilience was remarkable, but so too was the risk they bore each day. Superstition flourished in the climate of fear. Omens were read in bird calls, in dreams, in the flight of insects. A sudden illness, a poor harvest, a death in the family, these could be interpreted as signs of the Queen's displeasure or punishment from the ancestors. People lived not only under her laws, but under an invisible web of fear and belief, never certain where misfortune truly began. Markets remained lively, though even there the Queen's hand was felt. Traders sold rice cattle, salt and woven cloth, but goods from abroad grew rarer as Ranavalona restricted foreign trade. Cloth from Europe, metal tools and imported luxuries became scarce, their prices rising beyond the reach of common people. Some saw this as a return to self-sufficiency, others as a loss, but all felt the change. Stories of the Queen's cruelty circulated from mouth to mouth, passed quietly in huts and fields. Tales of nobles executed, of converts speared, of workers dying on the roads, each became part of the collective memory of her reign. Mothers warned their children never speak against the Queen and never disobey, for her spies are everywhere. In this way, fear became a lesson passed from one generation to the next. Yet paradoxically, there was also pride. For all the hardship, Madagascar remained free while so many African lands fell under foreign rule. Ranavalona's resistance to outsiders, though cruel in execution, gave her people a sense of identity and defiance. She was both a source of terror and a shield. Villagers could curse her in secret for her demands, yet also boast that their queen had kept the foreigners at bay. Everyday survival meant navigating this contradiction, balancing fear with pride, submission with resilience. Villagers learned to endure, to find joy in small things, a good harvest, a wedding feast, the birth of a child. Songs were sung, dances performed, rituals observed. Life went on even under the shadow of cruelty, but the toll was undeniable. Historians estimate that during Ranavalona's reign, Madagascar's population may have declined by half, from around 5 million to 2.5. War executions, forced labour, famine and disease all played their part. Entire communities vanished, swallowed by the Queen's insatiable demands and the hardships that followed. To live in Madagascar during those years was to live with uncertainty. A man could rise one morning to tend his fields and by evening be on the road to a labour camp. A woman could prepare her family's meal and suddenly be ordered to march supplies for soldiers. A convert could whisper a prayer in secret only to find soldiers at his door the next day. Life was fragile, precarious and always under threat, and yet in this atmosphere of hardship the Malagasy spirit endured. Families clung to traditions, to stories, to songs that reminded them of who they were. The land itself, its hills, forests and rivers remained a source of strength. Even in suffering, people found ways to resist despair. Ranavalona's reign had created a world where every day was lived on the edge of fear. But the people of Madagascar endured it with a resilience as remarkable as the Queen's cruelty was relentless. Soon, however, that cruelty would turn inward. As the years passed and her health began to falter, Ranavalona's paranoia deepened. The later years of her rule would bring new contradictions between her desire to protect Madagascar and the growing cracks within her own court. The Queen's final years. By the 1850s, Queen Ranavalona had ruled Madagascar for more than 2 decades. She was no longer the young, ambitious woman who had seized the throne in blood. Age weighed on her, and though her spirit remained fierce, her body began to betray her. The once commanding queen now suffered bouts of illness, long stretches of weakness, and the weariness of years lived in constant vigilance. But her will to control never faded. If anything, the approach of old age deepened her suspicion. Enemies she believed were everywhere among her nobles, her generals, her servants, even within her own family. The court of Antananarivo, already a place of whispers and fear, grew darker still as the Queen's paranoia sharpened. Her policies of isolation continued. Foreigners found Madagascar almost impenetrable. Traders were restricted, missionaries watched with hostility, diplomats frustrated at every turn. The Queen would not bend even as European powers grew more aggressive in their colonial ambitions. To her, concessions meant weakness, and weakness meant doom. Better, she thought, to endure hardship and decline than to surrender the sovereignty of her island. Yet inside her palace, contradiction simmered. Her son and heir, Prince Rakoto, had grown into a man with very different views. He had been educated, secretly corresponded with Europeans, and believed Madagascar could not survive forever in isolation. To him, his mother's cruelty and suspicion were destroying the kingdom rather than saving it. He admired the knowledge and technology of the outside world, and dreamed of bringing them into Madagascar without losing independence. The Queen and the Prince became uneasy opposites. Ranavalona clung to tradition and fear. Rakoto leaned toward reform and engagement. Their relationship was strained but cautious. She needed him as her heir, but she distrusted his ideas. He needed her to survive until succession, but he quietly prepared for a different future. Within the court, factions formed. Some nobles aligned themselves with Ranavalona, fearing change and clinging to the old ways that had preserved their power. Others whispered their support for the prince, seeing in him hope for a softer, more prosperous reign. This tension gave the palace an atmosphere of fragile balance where one wrong step might shatter everything. The queen's health added to the uncertainty. Periods of illness left her bedridden, and rumours of her imminent death spread like wildfire. Each time she recovered, returning with proclamations that she still held the blessing of the ancestors. But even the most loyal courtiers could see her strength waning. Time was running out. In these final years, Ranavalona's cruelty did not lessen, but it became more erratic. Executions still occurred, though not with the sweeping purges of her earlier reign. Instead, they seemed driven by bursts of anger or sudden suspicion. Ministers might fall in and out of favour overnight. A careless word could still cost a life, but sometimes mercy was shown without explanation. The Queen's rule became unpredictable, and unpredictability bred both hope and fear. Beyond the palace, the people of Madagascar endured as they always had. Fanompoana still drained villages, Christianity remained persecuted, and the weight of isolation pressed heavily on trade and prosperity. Yet the signs of change were visible. Despite her crackdowns, Christianity continued to spread quietly, especially among younger generations. Foreign goods smuggled or traded through limited channels found their way into markets. The world outside was growing closer, even as the Queen tried to push it away. Ranavalona herself became a figure of contradiction in the eyes of her people. To some, she was still the fierce guardian of Madagascar, the Queen, who had stood alone against foreign domination. To others, she was a cruel tyrant whose paranoia had cost countless lives. Among the common folk stories painted her as larger than life, half monster, half protector. She was feared, hated, respected, and in a strange way admired. In her private chambers, the Queen grew increasingly reflective. Though she never admitted weakness, she must have known the scale of bloodshed her reign had caused. Did she believe it was justified? Perhaps. She had kept Madagascar independent, had she not? Unlike so many lands around Africa, her island was not under a European flag. To her, this was proof that her cruelty had been necessary, that history would vindicate her. But history, as always, was more complicated. By the early 1860s, her health declined rapidly. She spent long stretches in seclusion, attended by a small circle of trusted servants. The court buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew the end was near, and with it a transformation of the kingdom. Prince Rakoto, waiting in the wings, prepared to inherit a throne heavy with blood and burden. When at last death came in 1861, it was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to the violence of her life. Ranavalona, the queen who had ruled with iron and fear for 33 years, passed away in her palace at Antananarivo. She was in her early 80s, a remarkable age for a woman who had lived so long in the storm of power. The news spread quickly. Some wept mourning the protector who had preserved their independence. Others rejoiced, relieved that the reign of terror was finally over. The atmosphere across Madagascar was one of mingled grief and hope, as if a long night had ended and the uncertain dawn was breaking. Prince Rakoto, who had become King Radama II, took the throne and swiftly began to undo much of his mother's legacy. He reopened Madagascar to the world, welcomed missionaries, and sought alliances with European powers. His reign would prove turbulent and short-lived, but it marked a dramatic turning point, a sharp contrast to the isolation of Ranavalona's era. For Ranavalona, death did not end her influence. Her memory lingered like a shadow, dark and heavy. To this day, she remains one of the most controversial figures in African history, a ruler remembered both as the defender of Madagascar's independence and as the tyrant who drenched her kingdom in blood. Her final years had been a slow decline into suspicion and frailty, but her legacy was anything but frail. She left behind a kingdom scarred yet still sovereign, and a name that would echo for centuries as a symbol of both defiance and cruelty. Death and legacy of a ruthless queen. When Queen Ranavalona drew her final breath in 1861, Madagascar stood at a crossroads. The woman who had ruled for 33 years with a will of iron and a hand heavy with blood was gone. Her passing was both an ending and a beginning. It closed one of the most brutal chapters in the island's history, yet opened the door to change. The Queen's funeral was grand as befitted a monarch. Nobles and officials gathered in Antananarivo, the capital she had so fiercely guarded. The sacred hill where her palace stood became the stage for rituals blending ancient Malagasy traditions with the gravity of royal death. Drums echoed, voices chanted, and offerings were made to the ancestors. To the faithful, her spirit joined the long line of monarchs who still guided the kingdom from beyond the grave, but not all hearts were filled with reverence. Among common villagers, her death was met with whispers of relief. Families who had suffered under Phanompona the endless forced labour allowed themselves cautious hope. Christians who had hidden their faith in secret gathered quietly to pray, sensing that freedom was near. Traders who had been shut out of Madagascar's markets anticipated a reopening of doors. To them, the Queen's death was like the lifting of a suffocating weight. Her successor Adamaseku wasted little time in undoing her legacy. He reopened Madagascar to foreigners, welcomed missionaries, and sought treaties with European powers. Where his mother had built walls, he opened gates. Where she had ruled by fear, he spoke of reform and progress. His reign would be short and troubled, but in those first days he embodied the complete reversal of Ranavalona's policies, and so history quickly began to judge her. Europeans who had long painted her as the mad Queen of Madagascar emphasized her cruelty, her paranoia, and the countless deaths of her reign. To them she was a symbol of barbarism resisting civilization. Missionaries who had suffered under her persecution wrote accounts that spread widely across Europe, filled with horror stories of poison trials, executions, and secret worship in the forests. Ranavalona became infamous, a name spoken with dread in Victorian circles, yet the Malagasy memory was more complicated. For all her cruelty, she had preserved the independence of her island during a time when European powers were carving Africa into colonies. While kingdoms across the continent fell under foreign rule, Madagascar remained sovereign, its throne unbowed. To some, this made her a defender of the land, a queen who sacrificed her people to protect the nation itself. This dual legacy protector and tyrant makes her story difficult to place neatly into history's categories. Was she a monster drunk on power and paranoia, or was she a tragic figure forced to embrace cruelty in order to shield her kingdom from conquest? Perhaps she was both. What cannot be denied is the scale of the suffering. Historians estimate that during her reign, Madagascar's population may have fallen by as much as half. Roads and palaces were built, but at the cost of countless lives. Christianity was stamped out with brutal efficiency, only to survive in whispers and re-emerge stronger after her death. Entire communities vanished, leaving scars still remembered in Malagasy oral tradition. And yet Ranavalona was not without cunning. She outmaneuvered European powers for 3 decades, playing France and Britain against one another, avoiding colonization while maintaining sovereignty. She ensured that Madagascar was not swallowed by empire, at least not in her lifetime. That defiance cannot be separated from her cruelty. The two were bound together in her rule. Today, historians debate her legacy with nuance. Some highlight her as one of the rare African rulers who successfully resisted European domination during the 19th century. Others emphasize the human cost of that resistance, arguing that independence achieved through terror left a kingdom weakened and divided. For the Malagasy themselves, she remains a figure of myth and memory, feared, hated, respected, and in some ways admired. Legends grew after her death. Some claimed her spirit still roamed the palace at Antananarivo, watching over the land. Others whispered that she had struck a bargain with ancestral spirits, ensuring her name would never be forgotten. In folk tales, she appeared as both villain and guardian, a reminder that the line between protector and oppressor is often thin. Her palaces still stand towering above the highlands, silent witnesses to the age of her rule. The roads she ordered carved through the wilderness remain as pathways across Madagascar. These monuments endure not only as signs of her power, but as echoes of the suffering that built them. To walk them today is to tread upon history itself, one paved with both defiance and death. In the end, Ranavalona's story is a mirror of power's darkest truths. She reminds us that rulers who protect their nations may also destroy their people, that the shield can be as deadly as the sword. Her reign shows how fear can preserve sovereignty, but at the price of countless lives. And so she is remembered not as a saint nor as a demon, but as a paradox, a queen who saved her island even as she bled it dry. The mad queen of Madagascar, the ruthless mother of the nation, the last guardian of independence. Her titles are many, her legacy enduring. More than a century and a half after her death, Ranavalona still stands as one of history's most infamous rulers. A woman who defied empires, crushed her enemies, and shaped Madagascar with fire and blood. Her story endures not because it is simple, but because it is complex, a tale of cruelty and survival of sovereignty and sacrifice. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her legacy, that we still speak her name, still wrestle with her contradictions, still feel the shadow she cast over her people and her land. Ranavalona, Queen Tyrant Protector Destroyer, remains forever one of history's most ruthless rulers,